Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. This will actually be the very last one, so at this point, if you followed the previous videos, I have covered every single one of Plutarch's lives that exist to this day. Obviously, as I mentioned before, some of them have gone lost. Actually, similar to the last video, this video is actually on two Romans as opposed to a Greek and a Roman, which is standard throughout these video series. It's just the structure of Plutarch's lives, and this is sort of how he ends it. Another thing to note is these are actually only two individuals that pass beyond 1 AD, so the most recent of all the lives as well. As for this quote, I usually start off with a quote from Plutarch at the beginning here, but I thought to include a little one of my own. Don't be a penguin, so I'll get into that at the end if you're at all interested. So without further ado, let's start with Galba. So Galba both of these take place in the year of what's called the year of 4 emperors, which followed Nero, and Galba was obviously the first in this pretty exciting year. So he came from a pretty powerful family, but he was a private citizen, so he was in no way related to Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar. He had no emperor blood, you could call it, but he came from the Servii family, which was a very powerful family. He's considered to be the richest private person ever to become emperor of Rome. He married a woman named Livia, he was very good friends with a woman named Livia, who was actually Augustus or Octavius's wife, so this got him into quite a bit of political power, and Octavius actually favored him quite a bit and granted him consul in Germany and Libya, where he actually performed particularly well in Libya and got a lot of fame for himself. But unlike Otho, who we'll discuss later, who becomes emperor as a very young individual, Galba doesn't really do much for the early parts of his life, and he doesn't become emperor until his 70s. So at this point, he was sort of retired. He had been living a pretty quiet life at this point. He'd sort of finished with his military duty. He was very temperate. He didn't eat too much. He was sparing in terms of expenses, and he had a disregard for appearances. All of these facts heavily contrast our next live Otho, as we'll soon discuss. But either way, this individual named Jannius Vindex, who was a general in Gaul, wanted to overthrow Nero, and Nero was the emperor of Rome at the time. Nero was getting a bit corrupt, and a lot of people wanted to overthrow him, and Galba wasn't even the one pushing for it, but he was the most famous person at the time, and he was the richest person at the time, or one of the richest people at the time. So Vindex actually asks Galba if he would like to be emperor, which is, the quote, "Some are born great, some have greatness thrust upon them." In terms of that quote, greatness definitely gets thrust upon this individual. So with that, Vindex offers him, he says he'll have 100,000 troops ready to go and to kill Nero and take over as emperor right away. And pretty much all the consuls is sort of like a general, and they're granted a certain region to be general over. Pretty much all of the consuls supported him, except for Claudius Macer in Africa and Virginius Rufus in Germany. And Plutarch notes they actually were against him for two different reasons. Claudius Macer was just, he thought that to overthrow Nero would not be a safe endeavor and could put his own life at risk. He was getting older at the time as well. But Virginius Rufus actually wanted to be emperor himself, and he thought if he couldn't be emperor, neither should Galba. And at the time, Virginius Rufus was actually he had the most powerful or most seasoned army. So this really sort of scared Galba off. Eventually, there's a war between Jannius Vindex, the one who's advocating for Galba becoming emperor, and Virginius Rufus defeats him pretty brutally, and 20,000 die. So Galba really repents even having the intention of becoming emperor, and once again he goes back to his retired life and lives in a little town called Clunia in Spain. While there, eventually this slave runs up to him and tells him that he had been named emperor previously, and not only that, Nero had killed himself. So with this, he said the man became great. So, and it wasn't even really his doing. He was off in retirement. He did not even expect this to happen. He was very happy. Of course, though, Icelus who was a freedman at the time, becomes the most powerful freedman in the land, and he gets given a gold ring. So they say don't shoot the messenger, but maybe don't award the messenger so much. But he doesn't end up being a particularly evil individual anyways, but just for bearing the message, he got quite heavily rewarded. And yeah, so he became emperor, and Nero actually committed suicide. So Nero was originally chased out of Rome, and then he had to take his own life because what else would he really do? But he did succeed as an emperor for quite a longer time compared to Galba or Otho. With this, Galba still really feared that Virginius Rufus would try to become emperor again, because he also had the most powerful army. So what he does is he sort of gets this younger individual named Vinius, and Vinius was pretty much hated throughout Rome, and it's pretty strange that Galba chose him to be sort of his main advisor or his right-hand man. Vinius was known to, at one occasion, one anecdote was he was at war, and he was having sexual relations with his commander's wife, and he went even as far to dress her up in soldiers' equipment and come with them in the battle, and he was having an affair with her in his own tent. So obviously something that wouldn't be considered by most to be respectful. And he was also very young, but he was also very boisterous, and he at one point he was actually put in prison for having sexual relations with his commander's wife. But eventually, when a new emperor came into power, he was actually freed, and the new emperor, Claudius Caesar, following Caius Caesar, invited Vinius to dinner, and he actually stole one of the emperor's cups, silver cups, which is probably not a good idea. But fortunately, Claudius had a good humor, and from then on, he never let Vinius eat off silver plates, but rather made him eat off like regular earthly bowls. So I guess through this, I guess Claudius's interpretation was that Vinius was rather more naive than ill-intentioned, and sort of had a sort of lack of respect. But nonetheless, Galba picks him as his sort of part of his entourage, and this really upsets a lot of people. He also, despite coming into power with so much fame, because he didn't even really have to push for it, he was getting old, and he was quite hideous looking because he didn't care about his appearance. At one point, an individual said, if he were to go out on the streets, this bald-headed man, they'd be ashamed to say that an individual like him had ever been Caesar. So obviously not too good, and so two strikes against him, both Vinius and his agedness. So this other individual named Nymphidius, one of the officers, plots to become emperor himself, and with his troops, he tells his troops that Galba is a good man, but he's controlled by Vinius and this other guy named Cornelius Laco, who is the general of the guard. So he kind of thought that, or it convinced his people or his army that Galba was just naive, he was getting old, and sort of the puppet of other individuals. So he sort of starts plotting to become emperor himself. He actually even wrote to Galba at one point, accusing his entourage, Vinius and Laco, of playing with him, of toying with him. But Galba quickly saw through this, and he saw that Nymphidius had the intent of becoming emperor himself, so he kind of shoots this aside. So with that, he sort of plots and he starts preparing a speech amongst his camp, or amongst his camp of soldiers, to declare himself emperor. But none of the soldiers actually consent, and they actually, when he actually prepares a speech, or has a speech prepared for him by Varro, a famous speech writer, and he even memorized the speech, and he was getting ready to do it, but there were people standing at the gates, so he couldn't enter, and they cheered Galba as emperor, so he just joined in because he didn't want to have too many issues. But when he entered, he was actually killed by some of Galba's supporters, or people who were rather not supporting his candidacy as emperor, if it even had a candidacy, because it's not really an elected role, and he is actually killed in his own tent. With this, Galba makes a sort of fatal mistake. He charges all the people who killed Vitellius without trial. So these were people who were loyal to him. They were loyal to his supporters. Obviously, Galba probably thought he was doing the right thing by convicting these people, but he was pretty much just betraying those who supported him most eagerly, and especially doing it in an unlawful way. So he sort of at this point has 3 strikes against him. He has Vitellius, he's old and unattractive, and he's sort of starting to betray his own people. And he sort of feels guilty for this, and so what he does is, instead of Vitellius, he picks this other individual named Piso to be his successor, because he had no actually heirs by blood that were eligible to become emperor, so he chooses this individual named Piso to be his successor. This really sort of upsets Otho, because Otho is kind of an upstart in the Roman political system. He was much younger. He was pretty much the opposite, and I'll talk about him more when we get into his actual life. But he was pretty much the opposite of Galba, in that he liked to party a lot. He was obsessed with his own beauty. He was sort of a narcissist, and he loved luxury. He was supposedly addicted to luxury. But this upset Otho, because Otho was part of his entourage. He was even allowed to ride in Galba's own carriage, but unfortunately he did not get chosen. And and he is also very upset. He is also one of the individuals who hated Vitellius as well, so a few strikes against him. So with this, it isn't even really fully his plot, but there's sort of an outbreak, and 7 people are killed, including Galba, Vitellius, and Piso. At one point, they bring Otho Galba's head, and he says to his soldiers, "This is nothing, fellow soldiers, unless you show me the head of Piso." But before just discounting Otho as some cruel individual, I think it's important to note that he was kind of convinced by the population to do this. Galba had fallen so far out of favor, and all the other potential candidates were probably even worse. He was a young, ambitious individual that was eligible for it, and it's said that he even said that he has lost his reason to live at one point for doing such an evil crime. But despite this, he actually proves to be a very, very good leader. Yeah, he says, "I am a lost man," and with this, we'll continue on to Otho's life. But before finishing with Galba, Plutarch congratulates him on being of having a great birth, which I don't think is necessarily a great thing to congratulate someone on, but he's also for having great riches, and also for becoming emperor. And it said that he should be congratulated for achieving it through fame rather than through force, which I think is definitely worth congratulating him for. I guess just to finish off with these quotes, at one point, during some group of troops were asked to wish health and happiness upon the emperor, and they said if he deserves it, because they thought that Galba was not deserving of their good wishes. Additionally, after they are all killed, only 7 lay dead, as I said, on the ground, including Galba, Vitellius, and Piso. Where we trod their bodies underfoot, but we who slew are 1,000. So basically, the murder was justified because it was 1,000 who killed them rather than 1,000. It was essentially 1,000 to 1, so kind of a mathematical ethical argument. And And I guess it sort of vindicates Otho a little bit there too. So moving to Otho. So first thing Otho does is he makes a big sacrifice, which is obviously considered a good and sort of moral thing to do. He says to an individual that he'd rather the people forget the accusation than remember the acquittal. So he doesn't want to be remembered for being acquitted, but he would rather they just simply forget about the accusations he put towards Galba. So I think it's just kind of a testimony to the way he felt about his crime or lack of thereof. He was defended because many of the people supported him, and he was in many ways pushed to do this. He said, they said that he had no obligation to be respectful or no obligation to have fidelity towards Galba. I think that argument could be contested. Galba did invest in Otho's career, and he did include him in his entourage, but he did sort of undermine him by not choosing him as his successor. But so does Vitellius, has that same argument, but Vitellius is also dead and didn't go to the lengths that Otho did. He is actually selected that he could be consul, which is like a general. So if he's emperor and general, it's a very powerful position. But instead he lets Virginius Rufus become consul. So I guess this is kind of a way of appeasing someone who could potentially be his enemy, which I think is a pretty good idea. For many of the individuals who were displaced by, he did not displace any of Nero or Galba's supporters. So he kind of tried to create peace between the two parties, or the two past supporters. And many of the people who had lost their fortunes as a result of either Nero or Galba, he tried to restore much of this. So once again, he's trying to really settle things down despite coming in at due to pretty harsh circumstances. And this won the respect of many of particularly the upper class. But most notably, he actually had more of the lower classes respect because they were the ones who largely overthrew Galba. A pretty important or pretty interesting anecdote was at one point the soldier class or the peasant class wanted to slay a lot of the individuals of the Senate because they thought the Senate or the nobles or the oligarchs wanted to potentially overthrow Otho and cause harm. So while Otho was having a dinner party with many of these people, they thought it would be a good opportunity to slay his potential enemies. But instead, he actually lets the nobles escape, and he begs the soldiers once they arrive not to cause harm. And the next day, and he even goes into tears to convince them not to do this. So he's really advocating for unity, and I really do think he cares about this, and we'll see even more to that. And the next day, he even goes to the camp of the soldiers and offers them a lot of money, and he says that he is thankful for their efforts to protect his reign, but it was perhaps unjustified. And he says that there are even enemies amongst yourself to first clean up, and he takes two pretty unfavorable members of the army and kills them. So this also wins him more favor. So he was really appreciated on both sides. And so this was, he actually only ended up reigning for 3 months, but I think he did a lot of great things as well. I guess we'll just go to it right now. So there was this individual named Vitellius who at first he was sort of on Otho's side, and Otho told Vitellius that, a lot of people accused Otho saying, he's just charming the army and charming the noble class because he wants war. But Vitellius, who is one of the consuls, he tells Vitellius not to create any war because there was pretty much peace throughout the land, and that's really what Otho wanted to achieve, and that's what Otho wanted to maintain. But Vitellius sort of goes against Otho and starts a war. With this, Otho is sort of convinced or forced to put down Vitellius as a sort of enemy of the state. Vitellius was obviously a very formidable opponent because he was exceptionally large, he was exceptionally tough, and he he might have been foreign-born, or at least he acted foreign-born. He was not as refined as Otho, Otho was kind of a pretty boy. He was almost sort of effeminate as well, and his own army that he does end up sending they're all very weak, because Otho's army had spent a lot of time at the theater. They've been relaxing. Many of them had never even fought a war, whereas Vitellius's army was very seasoned and very, very menacing. So at first, when he sends his army out, his generals fail pretty miserably, and Otho comes, and they really fear that they're going to lose the battle. So Otho launches a war council, and the army and his advisors tell him that he should wait for Vitellius to strike first in Gaul, so that they have time to prepare. But he thought, for a multitude of reasons, that this was a poor idea. Firstly, he thought, why wait until Vitellius is ready? Why go on his watch, go on his time? Additionally, or at least Plutarch believes, he really had personal ambitions. He wanted to prove himself, because he looked at other great, not just emperors, but great leaders of Rome, such as Pompey, Caesar, Sylla, and Marius, and they had all achieved greatness through great risk. So it said he leapt from a precipice, or he left everything to fortune, and he decided to have a battle with him. At first, there's sort of shambles, and there's a lot of micro battles, but eventually they go head to head, and the two legions face to face. So there's Vitellius's legion, called the Ravenous, which is obviously a very menacing name, and Otho's legion, the Assistant, which is obviously not a very menacing name. Those of the assistants, or Otho's legion, they were strong and bold, but they had never even fought a war before, whereas Vitellius's were old and weak, but they were very experienced. So the battle is fought for a long time, and I think it's kind of interesting that their two armies were both very reflective of their own personalities. But the armies fight on for a very long time, and eventually Otho does win. And this is like a great achievement, but many, many individuals died. And besides this main head-to-head conflict, his gladiators, who he had recruited, did not obviously perform very well, because gladiators, despite being good at training, they did not have the similar tactics that a legion might have, and they were defeated by Vitellius's superior cavalry. So even if they had the superior tactics of a Roman legion, it's still very difficult to defeat an army of cavalry. With this, Plutarch actually, since Plutarch was alive not long after this, and he went to visit Rome, because he spent a lot of his life in Rome. He was originally Greek. He was born just outside of Delphi, which is where the oracle was, it's not there anymore, but Delphi still exists, and you can go and see the ruins in ancient Greece. But anyways, he spent a lot of time in Rome, and that's why he learned to speak Latin and such. But he went to see this ancient temple, and he is told by, I guess it was his guide, but the guide had apparently fought in this battle. Apparently there were bodies stacked all the way to the roof, and Otho saw this, and he was very, very much upset him, because I think he felt guilty that all these people had died, perhaps at his cost, or perhaps at his fault as well. So he really repented this action and really felt guilty. Plutarch notes he had a discussion with this individual, saying that civil wars tend to be more violent than normal wars, because there's no incentive to keep prisoners. And I think that's a valid argument, because unless you can not only defeat the opposing side but also convince them to have differing beliefs, there's no point really keeping them in a pretty horrible way of thinking about it. But that's the way it was. So with that, Otho is very upset, and he is back at his camp, and many individuals who are wounded, because thousands had died through these battles, they were at his feet, and they were just saying, don't fight today, spend your time with us. And most dramatically, this one soldier comes up to him and says, "Know, O Caesar, that all of us stand in this fashion at thy side." And he stabs himself right in the camp. So this is proving that they have every intention to live and die for Otho. So Otho does probably the most surprising thing one might do. He goes back into his tent, and his servant comes, and well, he actually hides 2 daggers. He leaves 1 dagger behind and keeps 1 dagger in his room, and the servant comes and he tells the servant, "Leave before you might be accused of my death." And he stabs himself, and Plutarch makes sure to note this. He makes 1 grunt. Maybe it's indicative of his character, or maybe it's he just did it because he wanted to let people know that he had killed himself, or I'm not sure. In terms of the 1 grunt, I think that's sort of analogous to his reign as emperor, sort of 1 grunt, 1 big push. But he killed himself, and everyone was very upset, and he did this for peace, essentially, because he knew that if he were to remain, there would just be further bloodshed between him and Vitellius, and he put his own life aside. And he was only 38 years old at the time, so he could have spent a lot more time achieving much more greatness. But for this reason, amongst many other Roman emperors, he is included in Plutarch's Lives amongst the greats such as Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. So a great achievement and a great effort for glory. He right prior he says, and I think this is a cool speech, "This day, my fellow soldiers, I deem more blessed than that on which he first made me emperor, since I see you so devoted to me and am judged worthy of so high honor at your hands." So he was really moved by this action, especially when the individual killed himself, and he thought he was doing the greatest thing. So originally Virginius Rufus, who was one that he allowed to be consul, wanted to run for emperor. A lot of people wanted to run for emperor, but he actually ended up running away because he was too fearful, and Vitellius ends up becoming emperor of Rome. So Vitellius ends up winning here, but I think that Otho won in terms of general message and what it meant to the Roman people. And one quote to cap it all off, he says, it is far more just to perish one for all than many for one." So this is kind of like, I think, the 3 Musketeer quotes, all for one and one for all. But he did this, he killed himself to prove a message, and for that reason I think he's a great martyr. So yeah, that's the life of Galba and Otho. In terms of quick comparison, Plutarch actually, as I said, he doesn't have a comparison for all these lives, so this one I've just come up with myself. But I think the comparison is quite obvious. I think one thing to note is that Galba went from, I would say, like bad to good, in that he didn't really achieve too much in terms of his early life, but then he sort of has greatness thrust upon him. Whereas I would say that Otho went bad to good, in that, or also went bad to good, in that he started with a crime, but then he ended up doing so much greatness that I think it overshadows or completely disvalues that he is a murderer. But also for Galba, in terms of going from good to bad, as he gets it, but then he does commit some atrocities, like he convicts individuals without trial, his own supporters without trial, so he goes from bad to good, whereas Otho went from bad to good. So in terms of luxury, I think the comparison is obvious. Otho was very luxurious. He was obsessed with his beauty. It said that he would always shave very close, which was obviously a common thing to do today, but not a common thing to do in Rome. It said he put like mud on his face to like make it clean and make it, which was obviously, even today, men don't wear makeup, or some do, but it's not very common. So that was something pretty uncommon. Whereas Galba did not care about his appearance at all, and despite being one of the richest people ever to become emperor, he was very frugal and didn't really like luxury. And in terms of similarities, they both were emperors for very short periods, and I think most notably they were loved rather than feared or forceful, in that Galba was pretty much just chosen by the people, chosen to become emperor following Nero, and Otho was so loved by his people that they were willing to kill themselves without even substantial just cause. So yeah, I started off this by saying don't be a penguin. So I guess I don't think a lot of people read Plutarch's Lives, and I don't expect a lot of people to even watch these videos. But I think the main message throughout Plutarch's Lives is that they were all, despite coming from different backgrounds, achieving different successes, and doing all sorts of different things, they were all like an outlier in some sense. And I think the fact that a lot of people haven't read Plutarch's Lives might be the very reason that you should, in that it will be a differentiating factor. And I say don't be a penguin because, penguins all look the same, and I think it's kind of almost analogous or a metaphor for today. Everyone, they look like they're wearing suits, and that's sort of what society's starting to become. So anything you can do to differentiate yourself would potentially make you worthy of being included in Plutarch's Lives. So thank you so much. Don't be a penguin, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye.